Yeah, and we just crucify his ass. We unload on him and we just grind him. So I go out of the ring and I get a toolbox and I dump the toolbox out and there's this ball-peen hammer, right? Yeah, and we just crucify his ass. We unload on him and we just grind him. So I go out of the ring and I get a toolbox and I dump the toolbox out and there's this ball-peen hammer, right?
For decades, the name Hulk Hogan conjured images of bright lights, roaring crowds, and heroic victories. Draped in red and yellow, flexing muscles that seemed sculpted from comic books, and armed with a booming voice that electrified arenas, Hogan wasn't just a superstar, he was a cultural phenomenon. But behind the persona that defined a wrestling generation lay a man whose journey was far messier than the polished WWE image suggested. Terry Bollea, the man behind Hulkamania, lived through immense triumphs and painful betrayals, glory and scandal, redemption and regret. And while WWE's cameras captured the cheers, they rarely showed the shadows. This is not the sanitized story of Hulk Hogan, the icon. This is the complex reality of the man beneath the bandana. The birth of Hulkamania, wrestling's first global superstar in the golden haze of the 1980s, professional wrestling began to evolve into something more than a niche sport. It became a global entertainment juggernaut. At the center of this evolution stood Hulk Hogan. Born Terry Gene Bollea in Augusta, Georgia, in 1953, Hogan was a towering figure who had once aspired to play bass guitar in a rock band before being drawn to wrestling. When he debuted in the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, in the late 1970s, few could have predicted the revolution he would help ignite. It wasn't just his physique that stood out. It was his charisma. He looked like a superhero come to life. With each flex of his biceps and every "What you gonna do, brother?" roared into a microphone, Hogan captured the imagination of an entire generation. Children wore his bandanas. Adults watched his matches with awe. He became more than a wrestler. He was the embodiment of good versus evil. His persona radiated virtue, loyalty, strength, the American dream. When Hogan defeated the Iron Sheik in 1984 to win his first WWF championship, Hulkamania was officially born. From there, the sky was the limit. Hogan became the face of professional wrestling at a time when Vince McMahon was turning the WWF into a national and eventually global powerhouse. Hogan's influence extended far beyond the squared circle. He starred in action figures, cartoons, and television commercials. His guest roles in films like Rocky III and Suburban Commando blurred the lines between athlete and movie star. He was wrestling's first true crossover icon, paving the way for future superstars to branch into mainstream entertainment. But all that visibility came at a price. Cracks beneath the surface, rivalries, egos, and personal turmoil. The world saw Hulk Hogan as a symbol of power and positivity, but those who worked closely with him often told a more complicated story. Backstage in the wrestling world, where storylines are scripted but real tensions often simmer beneath the surface, Hogan's presence was as polarizing as it was powerful. One of the most infamous backstage feuds in wrestling history was between Hogan and Randy Macho Man Savage. The two shared an undeniable chemistry inside the ring, forming the beloved tag team known as the Mega Powers. Together, they headlined major events and captivated fans with their mix of brute strength and unpredictable energy. Yet off-camera, their friendship deteriorated. At the center of the fallout was Savage's wife and on-screen valet, Miss Elizabeth. Savage believed that Hogan and his then-wife Linda had interfered in his marriage, convincing Elizabeth that Savage was controlling and unstable. The lines between storyline and real-life drama blurred until they became indistinguishable. When the Mega Powers exploded at WrestleMania 5, it wasn't just wrestling theater, it was a dramatization of real animosity. Savage would go on to accuse Hogan of betrayal, and even years later, in interviews before his death in 2011, he called Hogan a punk and denied that their friendship was ever genuine. Hogan's own version of the story differed, and attempts at reconciliation between the two were largely unsuccessful. For fans who adored both men, it was a painful reminder that heroes on screen were not always harmonious in reality. The steroid era, lies, trials, and the unmasking of a culture. While personal feuds offered glimpses into Hogan's complicated relationships, the 1990s ushered in a crisis that rocked the very foundation of professional wrestling: the steroid scandal. For years, performers like Hogan had denied using performance-enhancing drugs, presenting their physiques as the result of hard work and clean living. But the truth was far grimmer. In 1991, the U.S. federal government launched an investigation into Vince McMahon and the WWF, accusing them of distributing steroids to talent. Hogan, whose massive build had long fueled speculation, was subpoenaed to testify in 1994. Under oath, he admitted to using anabolic steroids for over a decade to maintain his image and recover from injury. It was a moment that shook the industry, and one that punctured the myth of Hulkamania. Hogan's testimony didn't directly implicate McMahon, and the WWE chairman was eventually acquitted. But the fallout was undeniable. Hogan's once wholesome image was tarnished, and the trial confirmed what many had long suspected: that the wrestling business, as glitzy as it appeared, was built on physical sacrifice, bodily harm, and chemical shortcuts. The revelation also brought forward the emotional cost of Hogan's fame. In his testimony, he spoke about the intense pressure to look a certain way, to meet the expectations of millions of fans, to heal from injuries rapidly enough to keep performing. Steroid use, he implied, wasn't about cheating. It was about survival. A fragile fame, family drama, and public collapse. If the 1990s marked the beginning of Hogan's professional decline, the 2000s would expose fractures in his personal life. He launched the reality TV show Hogan Knows Best, hoping to rebrand himself as a loving father and husband. But the show instead exposed dysfunction, especially in his marriage to Linda and his relationship with his children, Brooke and Nick. In 2007, Hogan's son Nick was involved in a devastating car crash that left his friend John Graziano with permanent brain damage. The media scrutiny was relentless. Combined with his divorce from Linda, an ugly public split that involved accusations of abuse, infidelity, and reckless spending, Hogan's personal life became tabloid fodder. That same year, Hogan appeared to be spiraling. He later revealed in interviews that he contemplated suicide during this time, overwhelmed by the loss of control over his family and career. It was perhaps the lowest point of his life, a far cry from the invincible figure he portrayed for decades. He was no longer the hero vanquishing villains in the ring. He was a man battling depression, regret, and isolation. The 2015 racism scandal. WWE cuts ties. Just when it seemed Hogan had weathered the worst of his storms, 2015 brought another devastating blow, one that would change his legacy forever. During a lawsuit against Gawker Media over the release of a sex tape, a previously unreleased portion of the footage surfaced. In it, Hogan made deeply racist remarks, including multiple uses of the N-word and comments about his daughter's dating preferences. The reaction was immediate and brutal. In an era increasingly defined by social accountability, Hogan's words felt like a betrayal of the very fans who had once seen him as a symbol of strength and fairness. WWE acted swiftly, removing all references to Hogan from their website, erasing him from the Hall of Fame page, and terminating his contract. Hogan, once the most recognizable face in wrestling, was effectively erased from the company's history overnight. Public apologies followed. Hogan claimed the remarks were made during a dark period in his life and insisted that they did not reflect his true beliefs. He said he was ashamed, embarrassed, and committed to making amends. But the damage to his reputation was severe. For many, the hero of their childhood had become a symbol of hypocrisy and hidden prejudice. A fragile redemption, return to WWE, and lingering controversy. In 2018, after 3 years of exile, WWE quietly reinstated Hogan into the Hall of Fame. The move sparked fierce debate. Some fans welcomed him back with open arms, citing his legacy and contributions to wrestling. Others accused the company of turning a blind eye to racism for the sake of ratings and nostalgia. Later that year, Hogan returned to WWE television as the host of the Crown Jewel event. The response was tepid and divided. Applause was mixed with silence. Cheers were shadowed by doubt. It was clear that Hogan's legacy could never fully recover, not because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern of behaviors and controversies that had slowly chipped away at the icon he once was. WWE, too, seemed unsure how to handle his presence. His appearances were limited. Public statements were carefully worded. It was a quiet, conditional reconciliation, one that acknowledged his past while never fully embracing him as a face of the company again. The loneliness of legends, Hogan's life at 70. Today, Hulk Hogan is in his 70s. The muscles have softened. The spotlight has dimmed. Years of wrestling have left him with chronic pain, multiple surgeries, and a body that has endured more than most can imagine. He walks more slowly now. He talks more reflectively. And yet, the shadow of Hulkamania still follows him. For some, he remains a childhood hero. For others, he's a cautionary tale about fame, ego, and the costs of living inside a character for too long. He continues to make occasional appearances, signing autographs, meeting fans, and sharing stories from his golden days. But the man who once seemed immortal now appears unmistakably human, flawed, regretful, and, at times, quietly searching for redemption. The myth versus the man. Hogan's backstage influence and controversy. To millions of fans across the world, Hulk Hogan was more than just a wrestler. He was the face of an era, a cultural juggernaut who helped catapult professional wrestling into the mainstream. With his signature catchphrases, electrifying presence, and comic book-like heroism, Hogan defined the WWF, now WWE, of the 1980s and early 1990s. But behind the towering charisma and camera-ready grin was a man embroiled in countless backstage battles. A larger-than-life figure whose outsized influence cast a long and complicated shadow over the locker room. As his fame soared, so too did the tensions behind the curtain. Hogan's powerful political grip on the industry made him both revered and resented, turning locker room friendships into minefields and opportunities into obstacles for others. While the industry outwardly celebrated Hulkamania, many insiders privately whispered about his reluctance to put over younger or emerging talent, an essential right in wrestling where veterans lose to or elevate their peers in the ring to advance the broader narrative and promote the next generation of stars. Hogan, fiercely protective of his status, frequently refused to do so unless the payoff clearly benefited him. This reputation for backstage manipulation, choosing who got ahead and who was held down, sparked conflicts with numerous wrestlers, many of whom viewed him as a gatekeeper guarding his throne rather than a team player supporting the industry's future. Bret, the Hitman. Hart, a career undermined at WrestleMania. 9 few rivalries highlight Hogan's backstage power plays as starkly as his icy relationship with Bret Hart. Known for his technical mastery and understated charisma, Bret Hart had steadily climbed the ranks of WWE through grit, storytelling, and clean wrestling. By the early 1990s, fans were rallying behind the excellence of execution, and the company seemed poised to shift its focus from Hogan's superhero theatrics to a more athletic, grounded form of wrestling. But that transition was not to be seamless or painless. WrestleMania 9 in 1993 was supposed to be a passing of the torch. Bret Hart, then WWF champion, was booked in the main event against the massive Yokozuna. In what became a deeply controversial outcome, Hart lost the title after Yokozuna's manager, Mr. Fuji, threw salt in his eyes, a cheap, villainous move. The match ended, but before Hart could even collect himself, Hulk Hogan stormed the ring, confronted the still-celebrating Yokozuna, and, in a shocking turn of events, challenged him to an impromptu match. Within seconds, Hogan pinned Yokozuna, winning the title without any build-up or storyline justification. For Hart, this was nothing short of betrayal. The spotlight that was meant to cement his rise had been yanked away in favor of another Hogan coronation. What made matters worse was that Hogan reportedly refused to drop the title to Bret in a future match. Despite plans for Hart to be the face of the company, Hogan dismissed him as unworthy of carrying the company forward. Instead, Hogan opted to lose the title back to Yokozuna, using an over-the-top interference finish to protect his aura. To many, this signaled a conscious effort to halt Hart's momentum, a calculated decision to prioritize Hogan's legacy over WWE's evolution. The bitterness lingered long after. In interviews and autobiographies, Hart would often express a profound sense of loss, not just over the title, but over what he saw as Hogan's self-serving manipulation of the business. The moment at WrestleMania 9 wasn't just a booking decision, it was a turning point that denied Hart his rightful place at the top of the mountain during a crucial time in his career. Hogan's reluctance to pass the torch burned a hole in Hart's faith in WWE's creative direction, ultimately influencing his eventual departure from the company under similarly contentious circumstances. Shawn Michaels and the SummerSlam debacle. A match derailed by ego. More than a decade later, a similar story would unfold, this time involving another wrestling icon, Shawn Michaels. Known as the Heartbreak Kid, Michaels was an unparalleled in-ring performer with a reputation for showmanship and intensity. His clash with Hogan at SummerSlam 2005 was initially envisioned as a marquee trilogy, a dream feud between two eras designed to honor both legacies while delivering unforgettable storytelling across 3 high-stakes matches. The plan was straightforward. Hogan would win the first match at SummerSlam, Michaels would take the rematch on Raw, and the third match would settle the score. But behind closed doors, the wheels quickly fell off. Hogan, citing a sudden injury, announced he would only be wrestling once and insisted on winning that lone encounter. Complicating matters further, he wanted to portray a babyface hero, even after previous conversations had leaned toward him turning heel, villain, which would have fit better against Michaels's cocky, antagonistic persona. Michaels, blindsided and furious at the abrupt creative shift, took the ring with a plan of his own. That night at SummerSlam, instead of selling Hogan's offense in a standard serious fashion, Michaels exaggerated every move to a cartoonish degree, flipping, flailing, and flopping with such theatricality that it bordered on parody. What was supposed to be an epic showdown became a bizarre, uncomfortable performance, marked by sarcasm and open contempt. While Hogan left with the victory, the match itself became infamous, not for its drama, but for its behind-the-scenes baggage. In interviews years later, Michaels admitted he was frustrated with Hogan's politics, but said he had no choice but to follow through. Still, his passive-aggressive performance stood as a bold statement. Even wrestling's most iconic names weren't immune from Hogan's influence. But they could push back in the only way they knew how. The fallout from that match ended any hope of further collaboration between the two legends and cemented Hogan's reputation as a man unwilling to compromise when it came to his image. Brutus Beefcake. A friendship torn apart by fame and betrayal. Perhaps no relationship exemplifies the personal cost of Hogan's backstage dominance more than his decades-long friendship and eventual fallout with Ed Leslie, better known as Brutus the Barber Beefcake. The two men had been friends since the 1970s, breaking into the business together in Florida and working small promotions under various gimmicks, including a stint where Leslie played Hogan's kayfabe brother, Dizzy Hogan. When Hogan ascended to stardom, he brought Beefcake with him, ensuring that his old friend had a place in the spotlight. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Beefcake appeared in numerous main events, many of them centered around or involving Hogan. He was never considered an elite wrestler by fans or critics, but his connection to Hogan kept him relevant. In WCW, Hogan once again used his clout to get Beefcake signed, giving him a string of bizarre gimmicks including The Butcher, Zodiac, and The Disciple, all while the friendship behind the scenes grew increasingly strained. The final straw came in the 2000s, when Beefcake, in interviews and his memoir, accused Hogan of betrayal on multiple fronts. He claimed Hogan had pursued romantic relationships with his ex-wife, and later tried to make advances on his then-girlfriend Missy, causing a bitter rift. He also alleged that Hogan attempted to control aspects of his personal life, leading to an emotional and professional collapse in their bond. From lifelong allies to public enemies, their story became a cautionary tale of how fame can corrode even the deepest loyalty. Jesse Ventura. Broken trust and the battle over unions. Jesse "The Body" Ventura was once a close ally of Hogan's, both men breaking into the wrestling scene in the late 1970s and sharing admiration for flamboyant figures like superstar Billy Graham. Together, they trained, traveled, and rose through the ranks of the AWA and WWF. But the friendship didn't survive the 1990s, particularly after Ventura launched a legal campaign against WWE for unpaid royalties. In court, Ventura argued he was owed money for merchandise and commentary appearances. The lawsuit itself revealed deeper rifts, particularly when Vince McMahon testified that Hogan had ratted out Ventura's efforts to form a wrestlers' union. For Ventura, who prided himself on standing up for talent and challenging the corporate structure, this was an unforgivable betrayal. In his view, Hogan had chosen self-preservation and corporate loyalty over solidarity with fellow wrestlers. What had once been camaraderie turned into open hostility. Even after Ventura successfully sued WWE and transitioned into a career in politics, eventually becoming governor of Minnesota, he continued to publicly criticize Hogan. Rumors swirled that one of Hogan's conditions for joining WCW was Ventura's dismissal, and sure enough, Ventura was removed from WCW commentary shortly after Hogan's arrival. Hogan's 1998 appearance on The Tonight Show, where he wore a feather boa, a hallmark of Ventura's look, was seen by many as a passive-aggressive taunt. Ventura responded by questioning the integrity and authenticity of Hogan's public persona, even hinting that some of Hogan's military service claims were fabricated. Conclusion: the double-edged sword of wrestling immortality. Hulk Hogan's legacy is inarguably grand. He didn't just put professional wrestling on the map, he redrew it entirely, transforming the industry from carnival sideshow to global spectacle. His contributions to WWE's rise, his magnetism with audiences, and his ability to transcend sports into pop culture immortality cannot be understated. He was the prototype for the modern wrestling superstar, an icon whose impact touched every corner of the business. Yet the man behind the mustache remains a subject of fierce debate. To some, Hogan was a trailblazer who used his stature to keep the business alive. To others, he was a gatekeeper who prioritized personal glory over the collective good. His relationships were often transactional, his loyalty conditional, and his decisions fueled by an unrelenting desire to maintain control, traits that brought him both extraordinary success and considerable alienation. In the end, Hulk Hogan's story is one of duality. He was both savior and saboteur, hero and antagonist, depending on whom you ask. He built a legacy that touched millions, yet left trails of broken friendships and missed opportunities in its wake. Wrestling is built on the illusion of invincibility, but behind the curtain, even the strongest icons wrestle with insecurity, fear of fading relevance, and the cost of the power they hold. For Hogan, that cost was steep, and its echoes continue to shape his complicated legacy today. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more valuable updates.